Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening as the shadows lengthen and the wisdom of ages seeks to find purchase in the heart? Let us speak now of a realm forged in fire and faith, whose great shadow once stretched across the entire curvature of the world, the vast and mighty tale of the Spanish Empire. Yet, a kingdom newly unified must always seek validation, a grand project to justify the blood spilled and the treasure spent, lest be internal forces of discord rise once more in the sudden absence of a common enemy. Thus, when the Genoese mariner, Cristobal Colon, brought forth his audacious plans, the monarchs saw not mere charting, but the hand of Providence offering a new field for glory and conversion. It was an epochal bargain, the exchange of ancient, familiar certainties for the terrifying possibilities of the unknown oceans, funded by the wealth painstakingly gathered through generations of hardship and conquest. Colon's first voyage was not just an expedition. It was a tearing of the temporal veil, the moment when the physical limits of the European consciousness were irrevocably dissolved, and the finite world of the medieval maps was shattered by the staggering infinity of what lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The vast, turbulent ocean ceased being a boundary to be feared and became instead a wide, shimmering highway upon which the destiny of a newly empowered Spain was meant to traverse, laden with hope, ambition, and the seed of future tragedy. When the small fleet sighted land, a world previously unimagined, untouched by the long theological debates of the Old World, the encounter was marked by immediate wonder, followed swiftly by the fatal misunderstanding between two civilizations operating under utterly incompatible premises of ownership, piety, and wealth. The simple astonishment felt by the explorers at the novelty of the flora, the generosity of the natives, and the seemingly endless supply of natural resources quickly morphed into the predatory gaze of the conqueror assessing the defenseless abundance before him. The early settlements, such as La Española, were fragile, brutal cradles of colonial administration, where the nascent principles of the encomienda system, supposedly designed for Christian guardianship and labor organization, rapidly devolved into systems of forced servitude and horrific exploitation. The quest for immediate material gain, fueled by the relentless pressure of funding the newly unified crown's European ambitions, often drowned out the fragile voices of those few clerics who preached the gentle doctrines of compassion and justice toward the indigenous populations. The gold that filtered back to Seville, though initially a trickle, hinted at the unbelievable wealth that lay dormant within the continental mainland, whispering tales of sophisticated empires built not of wood and thatch, but of stone and silver and highly wrought gold. These rumors acted as a potent psychological poison upon the minds of the restless hidalgos seeking swift, desperate fame and fortune. It was in this fevered atmosphere that the great captains, men of immense daring and equally immense ruthlessness, such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, felt the pull of their extraordinary destinies. Similarly, Pizarro, traversing the high, cold spine of the Andes, encountered the sprawling, meticulously organized Inca Empire, isolating its ruler, Atahualpa, through treachery and calculated violence. The vast ransom of gold and silver paid for the emperor's life did little to save him, but it instantly and forever changed the economic equilibrium of the known world. This incredible influx of treasure, streaming from the ravaged heart of the Americas, solidified Spain's position not merely as a European power, but as the first truly global dominion, ruling lands separated by forbidding seas. The 16th century then ushered in the age of the Habsburgs, the house which inherited this dizzying, unprecedented sprawl, beginning with the figure of Charles V, grandson of the Catholic monarchs, whose patrimony included not only Spain, Naples, the Netherlands, and a vast section of Central Europe, but also this newly conquered, seemingly infinite world. He was the burdened monarch who truly presided over an empire where the sun literally never ceased to shine, a logistical and spiritual challenge that would have broken a lesser man. Charles V found himself eternally caught between defending the faith against the rising tide of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, fighting the encroaching power of the Ottoman Sultan in the Mediterranean, and attempting to govern the complex, distant territories of the New World through a burgeoning bureaucracy of councils and viceroys established far across the ocean. His was a rule defined by endless motion, perpetual debt, and the heavy, unyielding crown of universal Catholic hegemony. The silver mines of Potosi, high in the Bolivian mountains, became the beating heart of this global enterprise, pouring forth millions of tons of precious metal that funded the Habsburg Wars across Europe, allowing Spain to field the formidable tercios, the finest infantry formations of their age, whose discipline and morale were virtually unmatched. This American treasure provided the sinews of war, yet it also subtly weakened the domestic Spanish economy, fostering dependency on foreign goods and diverting energies away from sustainable internal development. Philip II, unlike his nomadic father, ruled from the calculated stillness of his vast monastery palace, El Escorial, viewing his duty not merely as a king, but as the appointed defender of Catholic truth against all heresies, be they Protestant or Ottoman. He was the bureaucratic soul of the Counter-Reformation, meticulous in his governance and unyielding in his orthodoxy. The immense paperwork flowing across his desk, dealing with everything from royal appointments in Manila to the quality of coinage in Peru, attested to the obsessive centralization of his rule. Under Philip, the Spanish global system matured into a complex, interlocking network of trade and defense, anchored by the Manila galleon route, which annually linked the silver of America with the silks and porcelain of China, creating the first truly sustained trans-Pacific economic connection. The vastness of this economic achievement was paralleled only by the relentless military pressure Philip exerted against his rivals, most famously against the rebellious Dutch provinces and the burgeoning naval power of England under Elizabeth I. The enterprise against England, culminating in the ill-fated voyage of the Invincible Armada in 1588, became a legendary turning point, a moment where the seemingly unstoppable divine mission of Spain met the unforgiving reality of storm, naval strategy, and the shifting balance of maritime power. The crushing defeat, though not immediately fatal to the empire, marked the psychological high-water mark of Spanish global dominance, signaling that the seas were now open to challenge and that the Lord's favor might not be exclusively reserved for the Catholic king. Despite this dramatic reversal, the flow of American treasure continued unabated, financing continued conflicts in Flanders and France, masking the deeper structural problems developing within the Spanish economy, primarily the corrosive effect of inflation, the price revolution caused by the very silver that was supposed to guarantee prosperity. The reliance upon colonial wealth allowed the traditional structures of the Hidalgo nobility and clergy to remain disproportionately powerful, resisting the modernization necessary to compete with the rising merchant classes of England and the Netherlands. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally acknowledged the independence of the Dutch Republic and confirmed the erosion of Habsburg authority in Central Europe, yet the colonial empire itself remained largely intact, a testament to the robust administrative structures established in the previous century. The great viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, though remote, maintained a degree of stability, becoming complex, self-sufficient societies with their own burgeoning local elites, defined by a unique fusion of Iberian and indigenous cultures. His death in 1700 and the subsequent War of the Spanish Succession plunged Europe into a devastating conflict intended to settle the question of who should sit upon the throne of Madrid and, by extension, command the resources of the Americas. The ensuing struggle was long and ruinous, fought across continents and oceans, fundamentally restructuring the geopolitical map. The eventual triumph of the French Bourbon candidate, Philip V, secured the monarchy for a new dynasty, but came at a heavy price, confirmed by the treaties of Utrecht. The Bourbon reforms focused on tightening control over the colonies, professionalizing the military, and increasing the efficiency of tax collection, viewing the American territories less as integral parts of a unified Catholic monarchy and more as sources of necessary revenue for the state. This centralization, while effective in boosting the flow of silver and tobacco back to Madrid, inadvertently created deep resentment among the colonial-born Spanish elites, the criollos, who felt increasingly marginalized by officials sent directly from the peninsula. Throughout the long, relatively stable 18th century, the empire enjoyed a period of material recovery and cultural confidence, driven by burgeoning trade and successful military maneuvers against British encroachment in the Caribbean. Yet, beneath this surface of renewed vigor, the intellectual climate in the colonies was shifting, absorbing the revolutionary ideas of liberty, self-governance, and natural rights that permeated the wider Western world. The seeds of independence were being sown, nurtured by both the administrative distance and the feeling of political slight. The Enlightenment in Spain, unlike in France, tended to be pragmatic and royalist, focused on improving infrastructure and scientific inquiry rather than radical political change. But the ideas, once crossing the Atlantic, took on a more volatile form among the Criollo class, transforming into arguments about local autonomy and the ultimate source of sovereignty, especially when the crown was perceived as weak or distant. The American Revolution provided a tangible model of successful secession, demonstrating that the authority of the metropolitan power could indeed be successfully cast off through coordinated action. The Great Crisis, the precipice upon which the fate of the entire empire balanced, arrived with the catastrophic era of Napoleon, whose ambitions fundamentally destabilized the established order of the Iberian Peninsula and, by direct consequence, the structure of colonial loyalty. When Napoleon tricked the Spanish royal family into abdicating in 1808 and installed his own brother, Joseph, upon the throne, the legitimate source of sovereign power vanished overnight, leading to an immediate crisis of loyalty and governance in the colonies. These wars were civil conflicts as much as they were struggles for independence, pitting criollo against criollo, and often involving indigenous and mixed-race populations who sought their own, often divergent, forms of freedom within the chaotic void left by the absence of stable Spanish authority. The sheer scale and simultaneous nature of these uprisings, stretching from Mexico to Argentina, proved overwhelming to the weakened and politically fractured Spanish crown, still struggling to secure its own homeland against French occupation. By the 1820s, the vast, shimmering edifice of the mainland American empire had dissolved, replaced by a constellation of newly formed republics, each grappling with the complex inheritance of colonial institutions, vast internal divisions, and the brutal legacies of war. Spain was left with only the valuable islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and the remote, crucial Philippines in Asia, remnants of a glory that had spanned 3 centuries. This loss was not just territorial, It was the final, irreversible blow to Spain's status as a global superpower, confining its destiny henceforth primarily to the European theater. The memory of the lost empire, however, remained a powerful, persistent psychological force within Spain itself, defining the 19th century as an era of internal political strife, marked by a constant, melancholic grappling with the concept of decadencia, decline, and the painful question of what it meant to be Spanish in a world that no longer feared or relied upon Madrid. The focus shifted to maintaining the remaining insular territories, symbols of a connection to the fated greatness, even as these islands became objects of increasing strategic desire for rising powers, notably the United States. Cuba, in particular, became the object of fierce loyalty and economic exploitation, its sugar plantations generating massive wealth that bolstered the struggling finances of the mother country, even as the island's population increasingly demanded autonomy and recognition, leading to long, brutal conflicts for independence. The final chapter of the 4th-century empire was written in the dramatic confrontation with the United States in 1898, a swift, one-sided war that shattered the remaining illusions of Spanish might. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, though militarily devastating, provided a strange, purifying release for Spain, forcing a profound period of national introspection known as the Generation of '98, where thinkers and artists wrestled with the true essence of Spanish identity, freed finally from the exhausting burden of imperial management. The empire was gone, reduced now to a small, contained realm, yet the immense cultural, linguistic, and religious legacy it had sown across 2 hemispheres remained, a profound and enduring testament to its historical scope, defining the new world even in its absence. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The nation, stripped bare of its transoceanic holdings, found a curious, painful freedom in its shame, a necessary solitude that allowed it to gaze upon the ruins of its own heart without the constant distraction of foreign wars or the immense logistical demands of a global domain. This intellectual rebirth, driven by poets and philosophers who demanded a fierce return to the purest, often harsh Iberian roots, sought to redefine greatness not through conquest, but through the deep understanding of its unique cultural spirit, recognizing that the true empire resided now in the eternal Castilian tongue and the enduring Catholic faith sown across the Americas. Yet, the relief was ephemeral, for the internal contradictions that the 4th-century empire had long masked through external expansion now surfaced with raw, undeniable force, pitting traditionalists against liberals, the peasantry against the new industrial elite, and the assertive regional identities against the centralized state that had defined Madrid's power. The weight of this shrunken legacy, though geographically contained, felt heavier still, for it demanded answers not about the control of distant gold, but about the fundamental nature of justice, land ownership, and societal organization within the peninsula itself, questions that had been deferred since the time of the Catholic monarchs. Seeking a diminished echo of former glory, the gaze of the aging kingdom turned southward, across the narrow Straits of Gibraltar, towards the rugged, sun-scorched lands of North Africa, where small, precarious colonies offered a tantalizing, yet tragically bloody, distraction from profound domestic woes. These Moroccan protectorates, particularly the Eastern Rif region, though insignificant when compared to the lost viceroyalties of the Indies, demanded constant, exhausting military campaigns against fiercely independent Berber tribes, draining the meager national treasury and consuming the lives of young conscripts drawn overwhelmingly from the working classes. The African adventure proved to be a corrosive mirror reflecting the nation's enduring organizational decay and military hubris, leading to widespread demoralization among those tasked with fighting a war that offered no discernible benefit to the common citizen. The Riffian Wars became a dark, protracted agony throughout the early decades of the new century, revealing the utter unpreparedness and structural corruption of the Spanish military establishment, which clung desperately to obsolete tactics and an outdated sense of national invincibility, costs ultimately paid in the lives of ordinary men. This African mire served as a constant, open wound upon the body politic, culminating in the devastating annual defeat of 1921, a massacre that shocked the populace and irrevocably shattered whatever trust remained between the crown, the generals, and the disillusioned public. It was this disastrous military performance, fueled by the perceived failure of the democratic institutions to govern or control the armed forces, that provided the pretext for the inevitable return of strongman rule. Yet, the very act of dictatorship, though it successfully subdued the Rif rebellion and oversaw a brief period of infrastructural modernization, merely postponed the necessary reckoning, failing utterly to address the deep tectonic fault lines that ran beneath the surface of Spanish society. The repressive silence enforced by the military regime did not extinguish the flames of ideological fervor, but rather banked them, causing the pressure to build silently in the hearts of intellectuals, regional nationalists, and the newly politicized urban workers, awaiting the inevitable moment of release. When the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera crumbled under the weight of economic recession and internal military opposition in 1930, the monarchy of King Alfonso XIII found itself hopelessly isolated, having unwisely tied its fate to the temporary brute force of the military ruler rather than fostering genuine democratic legitimacy. The swift municipal elections held shortly thereafter became a decisive plebiscite not merely on local governance, but on the enduring question of monarchy itself, resulting in a crushing victory for Republican and socialist coalitions in every major city, symbolizing the undeniable popular rejection of the Bourbon dynasty. The speed and depth of these revolutionary changes, though necessary in the eyes of the progressives, served only to terrify and galvanize the entrenched forces of reaction, the great landowners, the high command of the army, and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, who perceived the Republic not as a necessary modernization, but as a blasphemous, communist-inspired assault upon the very soul and historical destiny of Spain. The political atmosphere quickly curdled from hopeful dialogue into bitter, irreconcilable polarization, transforming legislative chambers into cauldrons of righteous, unforgiving ideological fury where compromise was deemed betrayal by both sides. This period became a profound testing ground for the Spanish soul, wherein the centuries-old argument over its identity, whether it was to be defined by its Catholic, imperial past or by a secular, European, and democratic future, erupted violently in the streets and across the fields. Each election, each strike, and each religious or anti-clerical act was charged with the existential weight of this historical schism, making governance virtually impossible for any single faction, leading to a constant cycle of short-lived cabinets and intensifying radicalization at the societal fringe. The army, long accustomed to being the ultimate arbiter of Spanish destiny and deeply resentful of the Republic's attempts to reform or reduce its influence, watched these events with simmering disdain and strategic impatience, convinced that only a swift, decisive military intervention could save the nation from what they viewed as anarchic self-destruction. The old imperial pride, unable to project outward onto new conquests, now turned fiercely inward, claiming the right to cleanse the motherland of those elements deemed un-Spanish or corrosive to the traditional faith and centralized authority. This conviction crystallized in the hot summer of 1936, following a period of escalating political assassinations and social chaos, when a significant faction of the armed forces, led by generals intent on restoring order and traditional Catholic rule, rose in rebellion against the legitimate Republican government, igniting the conflagration that became the Spanish Civil War. The initial military coup failed to achieve its rapid objective, however, as large portions of the Navy, Air Force, and police remained loyal to the Republic, forcing the conflict to descend into a brutal, protracted struggle that tore the very fabric of the nation asunder. The war that followed was not merely a territorial contest, but a profoundly spiritual and ideological crusade fought with medieval fervor, serving as the final, agonizing exorcism of the historical contradictions inherited from the age of empire and absolute monarchy. On one side stood the nationalists, proclaiming themselves the saviors of God and Spanish tradition, utilizing the ancient banners and symbols of the unified Catholic kingdom, drawing support from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, who saw in Spain a testing ground for their new mechanized strategies of terror and conquest. Opposite them stood the Republican forces, a chaotic yet deeply committed coalition of socialists, communists, anarchists, and liberal Democrats, fighting desperately for the promise of a future defined by social justice, secularism, and individual liberty, drawing fleeting and often insufficient support from the Soviet Union and the idealistic international brigades. The ancient land became a terrifying prelude to the coming global war, a stage upon which the great ideological battles of the 20th century were first rehearsed in terrifying detail, watched with fascination and horror by the rest of the world. For 3 harrowing years, the war consumed Spain, destroying cities, tearing apart families, and executing hundreds of thousands on both sides in brutal reprisals, motivated by political creed or religious passion, leaving behind a legacy of bitterness and trauma that would define the national consciousness for generations. The former imperial power, whose fleets once ruled the oceans, was reduced to a desolate theater of ruin, where its own sons were consumed by the long-deferred argument over its identity, culminating in a complete exhaustion of national vigor. This regime enforced a severe centralization of power, actively suppressing regional cultures and languages that had briefly flourished during the Republican period, resurrecting the unifying but ultimately rigid Castilian model of governance that had characterized the Golden Age, albeit now enforced through relentless state censorship and repression. The memory of the empire was selectively resurrected, not as a source of cultural influence or global exchange, but as a rigid political model of unity, order, and national mission against the perceived threats of liberalism and modernity, turning the face of the nation deliberately backward. The regime eventually found a pragmatic, if cynical, rapprochement with the Western powers during the Cold War, primarily due to Spain's strategic geographic position as a bulwark against perceived communism, leading to a slow, controlled economic opening and a gradual modernization that crept into the rigid societal structures. The industrialization of the 1960s, known ironically as the Spanish Miracle, brought rapid material change and urbanization, but the underlying political repression and the heavy hand of the state ensured that the centuries-old argument over freedom versus order remained firmly submerged, ready to erupt once more upon the eventual departure of the strongman. Even as the nation became increasingly industrialized, shedding the agrarian identity that had defined it since the Middle Ages, the burden of the remaining colonial possessions, though small, continued to fester, primarily the disputed territory of Spanish Sahara in North Africa. This last, remote outpost of the former empire represented the final vestige of global responsibility, one that would need to be addressed and painfully relinquished, marking the true, complete territorial conclusion of the imperial narrative, long after the great treasures had been lost. This crucial period, known to history as the Transition, demanded a complex and profound compromise from all political factions, a deliberate, difficult pact built upon mutual amnesty and a conscious decision to refrain from settling the scores of the preceding 40 years. The revitalized left accepted the presence of the monarchy and the integration of many Franco-era institutional structures, while the entrenched right permitted the legalization of political parties long suppressed and the eventual drafting of a progressive, liberal constitution. It was a pragmatic societal bargain of purposeful forgetting, a necessary, expedient sacrifice of historical accountability in exchange for guaranteed stability and the immediate peace required to rebuild a shared, sustainable civic life. The foundational cornerstone of this new order was the crafting of the Constitution of 1978, which established a sovereign, constitutional monarchy and began the arduous process of territorial decentralization denied since the failure of the Second Republic. This carefully engineered document officially recognized the deeply rooted regional identities, Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia, by granting them substantial and historic levels of autonomy, seeking to neutralize the powerful centrifugal forces that had always challenged the centralized imperial vision of Madrid. Yet even this masterful legal architecture left many profound, ancient wounds unhealed, particularly those related to the language, cultural identity, and ultimate political sovereignty of these vibrant, distinct nations within the nation. Even as the fundamental institutions of this nascent democracy took tentative root, the young nation was immediately besieged by profound, destabilizing challenges, most notably the relentless and brutal campaign of violence waged by separatist terror organizations, particularly the implacable ETA in the northern Basque territories. Furthermore, the unforgiving global economic headwinds of the 1970s struck the newly opened Spanish economy with full force, exacerbating existing regional inequalities and fueling widespread social unrest amongst a population that had been explicitly promised immediate prosperity alongside their newfound liberty. The volatile combination of persistent political instability and deep economic vulnerability created a tense, perpetually fearful atmosphere, where the fragile democratic experiment seemed at every sunset to be perpetually close to a definitive, sorrowful collapse. With the democratic foundation finally secured against internal assault, Spain turned its unified gaze firmly outward, recognizing in earnest that its future prosperity, stability, and enduring security were inextricably linked to its integration with the broader European community of nations. The long, arduous negotiations to join the European Economic Community commenced in earnest after the death of the dictatorship, culminated in full membership in the year 1986, marking the formal and decisive end of centuries of relative diplomatic isolation and punishing ideological exclusion. This vital integration provided immediate, necessary economic stimulus, unlocking vast access to European structural funds for development and, most crucially, establishing a firm, external democratic anchor that made any return to dictatorial rule virtually an impossibility, thus solidifying the nation's irreversible place amongst the Western liberal democracies. The nation's economic ascent and political liberalization were quickly paralleled by a massive and vibrant social and cultural explosion, known widely as the Movida Madrileña, where decades of repressed artistic expression and suppressed social desires burst forth in a dizzying torrent of creative energy and unapologetic modernity. The strict moral codes previously imposed by the Catholic Church and the iron grip of the dictatorship rapidly dissolved under the warmth of newfound freedom, ushering in an era of unprecedented personal liberty, highly provocative artistic experimentation, and the formation of a confident, internationalized cultural identity. The youth of Spain, having never personally known the horrors of the Civil War or the crushing silence of dictatorship, joyously embraced this new openness, fundamentally reshaping the collective national consciousness and demonstrating a rapid, determined departure from the deep shadows of the immediate past. Yet the very process of political decentralization and the granting of substantial autonomy, which had been originally intended to unify the nation by respecting profound regional differences, soon began to create new, intense constitutional stresses, particularly within the economically prosperous and historically proud region of Catalonia. Here, long-standing cultural grievances quickly morphed into assertive political demands for increasingly greater separation and ultimately absolute political independence from the central structures of the state. The constitutional framework, while robustly protecting civil liberties, proved ultimately insufficient to fully contain the powerful resurgence of deeply ingrained regional nationalisms that viewed Madrid not as a shared capital of equal parts, but as the enduring center of an oppressive, centralized unitary state structure. These complex territorial tensions, temporarily quieted by the immediate demands of the political transition and the rush to European integration, lay coiled ominously within the federalized structure, ready to become the single most defining constitutional crisis of the subsequent new century. As the 21st century dawned, Spain successfully navigated the final steps of economic modernization and the crucial transition to the euro, joining the single currency and subsequently enjoying a decade of immense construction, tourism, and rapid growth that seemed to affirm its lasting status as a fully modern European power. However, much of this celebrated growth was dangerously built upon unsustainable private debt and wildly speculative real estate bubbles, creating a highly fragile prosperity that was easily shattered by the merciless impact of the global financial collapse of 2008. The subsequent, devastating recession exposed deep and painful flaws in the national economic structure, plunging the nation into renewed social crisis, sending unemployment soaring, and profoundly eroding the populace's faith in the political institutions that had been established during the sacred, foundational years of the transition. This economic pain, coupled with political disillusionment, spurred the dramatic rise of new political forces, both on the far left and the far right, which explicitly rejected the grand bipartisan consensus that had governed the nation since 1978, threatening to fracture the very foundations of the political landscape once more. Simultaneously, the decades-long Pact of Forgetting, the agreement to bury the Civil War for the sake of peace, finally gave way to a powerful and profound national demand for historical reckoning, forcing the unresolved wounds of the 1930s back into the sharp light of public debate and political action. This critical search for justice and truth, embodied by the controversial law of historical memory, aimed to provide official recognition and redress to the victims of the Franco regime, facilitate the difficult exhumation of thousands of unmarked mass graves, and ensure the swift removal of the last visible vestiges of fascist symbology from public squares. This ongoing, visceral struggle over the appropriate memory of the Civil War and the subsequent dictatorship ensured that the great, defining ideological schism of the 1930s continued relentlessly to shape and define the contemporary political landscape, proving that true, lasting peace requires not merely imposed silence, but eventual, painful, and shared acknowledgement of the deepest wrongs of the past.